Al Johnson is senior analyst at Crisis Group. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
No, my pleasure.
Uh, the ELN blamed the bomber, identified an accomplice, arrested. Why now? Why at this particular juncture when we've seen on and off talks between that Marxist rebel group and the government?
Well, this kind of reflects for us at Crisis Group, it reflects kind of some internal tensions within the ELN regarding peace talks specifically. The ELN had declared a unilateral truce around Christmas that lasted about 10 days and in general was actually fairly well carried out. But the ELN is not necessarily unified around the idea of the peace talks. And so often what happens is when the group carries out a pro-peace action, something like a truce in this case, we see internally the pendulum swings back the other way, and those who are more radical or perhaps more militarily focused then are given the freedom for to carry out their strategy and what they think is the best way to deal with the Duque government. So we think that now what this represents is happens now because the pendulum has swung back to the military wing or the very radical military parts of the ELN. And there are certain dates within ELN culture, let's say, that are important in January. So we think it's with those dates and the pendulum, plus the idea that the ELN probably has the idea that they want to hit the Duque government hard as soon as they can. That probably all kind of combines to explain why this attack happened now.
Kyle, you talk about ELN culture. How is this group different from the FARC, which signed that historic peace agreement in 2016?
There are actually multiple differences. I think the ELN are a bit more radical in their viewpoints of things. They're a bit more dogmatic in their understanding of the world and of Colombia, and that affects their strategies and their politics. The FARC were extremely pragmatic and understood that they were not going to win the war, so it was better to negotiate. The ELN, on the other hand, actually don't feel they need to win the war, which makes it much more harder to deal with them and to negotiate. At the same time, internally, there's a lot more autonomy within the ELN, and so this type of attack can be planned and carried out without the ELN commander Gavino is his name knowing about it, because each unit has a level of autonomy to carry out certain attacks. Where in the FARC, we didn't see that. FARC was very vertical. You mentioned this was the biggest attack in 15 years. The last one was carried out by the FARC, and we know it was negotiated within the group at a very high level. That was probably not the case of this attack within the ELN. This was probably planned, and maybe some of its leaders knew about it, but it wasn't planned from the leadership. So with a very dogmatic group, very radical, much more radicalized group, with the idea that they don't need to win, these types of attacks are less costly than for a guerrilla group like what the FARC were.
It's not every day we hear about a 56-year-old suicide attacker. The prosecutor also mentioning that the suspect in this, a one-armed explosive man who lost his hand making explosives way back, and who shuttled back and forth across the Venezuelan border. What do you make of them?
It is a bit strange. Finding explosive experts within guerrilla groups in Colombia who have lost a limb is not uncommon. You see it in the FARC as well. The ELN presence in Venezuela is something that's been known for a very long time, and ELN fighters and former members speak of it as being kind of a long-term thing. This is nothing new by chance. The fact that he's a bit older is not common. We think that the fact that he ended up dying in the attack was more of an improvised response to the circumstances. I don't think the plan was for him to go for the explosives fighter to go and actually kill himself. It just ended up happening that way unexpectedly. It is strange that he's a little older, but it kind of cuts both ways. It's not normal to see an old guerrilla fighter, so maybe that's more beneficial in terms of carrying out the attack. But at the same time, it's still a bit weird. But I think this is not necessarily, if we look at the ELN as a whole, if we assume, okay, this was the ELN, if you had to pick a unit or from the ELN who would have been responsible for this, you would pick one who is very close to the units on the Venezuelan border and who historically has kind of operated on both sides as well. So in that sense, some of these weird puzzle pieces actually come together a little bit, even though some leave some lingering doubts, let's say.
Kyle Johnson, just very briefly, what do you do now if you're Colombia's president, Ivan Duque?
It's very difficult to see Duque continuing with the peace talks. The government was already toying with the idea of ending the peace talks through a very specific legal mechanism in the next month. From here on out, it's very difficult to see him continuing with the talks. I think he will end up if he is certain it's the ELN, I think he will end the peace talks, formally end the peace talks. And I think what we'll see is an intensification of the conflict against the ELN as they go for those responsible. This also may end up having an effect on the diplomatic relationship with Venezuela and the regional response to the Maduro dictatorship in Venezuela as well. But that will depend a little bit on the cards that Duque wants to play in the next few months.
Kyle Johnson of Crisis Group, many thanks for joining us from Bogota.
No, thank you very much.